Hello, everyone. Well, thanks very much for coming to the session, and the live discussion will follow a brief slide presentation. And so we have many factors impacting so my slides are not moving forward. Okay, sorry about that. So as we all know, business models have not kept up with current need, and we have journal publishing business models that have crept. There's a mission creep that's creeped, and many companies have gone beyond publishing journals and other content and gone from that and expanded into various services, and that could be platforms, analytics, moving into the research enterprise of universities, and all of those add cost elements. So that's one factor. And a big factor is that costs keep rising, but library budgets are declining. And we're finding that this gap can't be bridged. The math has become unsustainable. And recently, the pandemic has added additional pressure points. The massive large-scale shift to online instruction has added considerations such as health safety measures, limiting in-building hours, staggering work schedules for people who are working in the building. And the large-scale shift means heavy reliance on the online resources and ebook versions of literary classics that are hard to find, streaming videos needed in much larger amounts, and the marketplace has been unresponsive to a large degree, or responsive in the sense of willingness, but not fast enough to respond in real time to the needs on the ground right now. Before the pandemic, there have been years of open access growth that has also complicated the picture, because library budgets are at best constant in number, but open access then presents the challenge of, well, where do we put the funds? Do we support authors, or do we enter transformative agreements? What if there are some predatory practices that we haven't fully recognized? So there are some risk factors in getting the best use for our funds. Then marketplace pressure points are mergers and acquisitions, and there are numerous scenarios, and we've seen it with system vendors. We've also seen it with company service providers. For example, niche book service providers have been bought by larger companies, and those are bought by larger companies. And I'll give you one example of Blackwell that had a North America arm, and then Blackwell in Britain spun off Blackwell North America. Baker and Taylor bought Blackwell North America. Later, Yankee Book Peddler bought Blackwell North America, and then YBP, Yankee Book Peddler, was recently purchased by EBSCO. And there are also some niche databases that come under larger database vendors' umbrellas as the acquisitions keep buying up companies. So there might be a small database that would be produced by a small society, and then a commercial company takes it over that's small, and then a large vendor takes it over. But then as the large vendor buys up all these databases and that portfolio grows over time, the people that were originally involved with that database in depth are no longer there. So no one has a true memory of what that product was all about, what the user base was all about, what those needs were in those disciplines. And then it becomes a constant back and forth conversation between the librarian wanting to make these databases usable for the ultimate students and faculty members in that discipline, and the product person on the other end who doesn't really understand the product. And then when service providers are bought up, then also there might be fewer people involved, or the original people go do something else. And so there's less of an institutional memory, but the company that's buying up the smaller vendors then has this large portfolio and may have expertise in keeping those services going. But it's also possible that the expertise isn't really there, and that those who've taken over those services don't really understand what that product was about, what the needs were that drove the creation of those products and services. And then libraries find themselves at the receiving end of diluted services or snags, and the companies trying to provide those services find themselves under pressure because they don't really truly understand what this is about. There may not be enough people to service it properly. So there's that element. So it's capacity issues creeping in on both sides. And some companies are purchased by investors, or they're publicly traded. And depending on the thought process of the holding company or the company policy with regard to shareholder relations, there can be an immediate not threat per se, but an underpinning of short-term thinking. And that impacts the quality. It also impacts the service. And in the pressure to produce monetary returns, the company trying to provide the services is distracted from providing the services that form the portfolio of that company. So it becomes complex. And then libraries on the receiving end of the services or products face higher prices. They face diluted quality, maybe service that's inconsistent. And there are several studies. There's the periodicals price survey, and the latest one is called Follow the Money, and it goes beyond just the journal prices in the discipline. It does a good job of capturing cost factors. Even though it's focused on journal pricing, it is a good overview of the various aspects that feed into journal production and the prices, and looks at library funding on the other end of facing those prices. So the business model question is a call to get at the true cost. And in business, there's a tool. If any of you have a management accounting background, then there's something called activity-based costing, and that aims at finding out the true cost of products and services and to better get at the indirect costs. So we've all seen job costing sheets. For example, if we're bidding on a job, working on a house or a construction project, or you take your car in and you get an estimate that describes the different parts that feed into the finished service. And that's an example of activity-based content-based costing, where there's a thinking through all those components that feed into the finished product, whether it's a physical production facility, as with print. And even though print is waning in the face of growing digital production and growing demand, but those legacy factors still factor into the pricing. And so we have these components that aren't as strong a factor in what it takes to produce that content, but it's still driving costs for, say, subscription journals, and not taking into account the new infrastructure that it takes to produce those. And as the physical production wanes, it's still hanging around, so it's not completely phased out. So there could be a cost attached to that. Then there are technology costs, servers, cybersecurity, access management, digital publishing tools, and of course enough bandwidth to allow the use. So there's server space and that technical infrastructure and that costs. And then there's also the lasting intellectual component that's related to content editing and review, and of course also acquiring the content. And if we're looking at academic publishing, numerous sources and studies related to academic authorship have argued that the authorship doesn't present labor costs to the publishers, because those are submitted at no monetary cost to those publishers by authors, scholarly authors or scientific authors. And the peer review, if it's done by members of that same group, then there's also no labor cost for the publisher. Then there are editorial costs, which may be true costs if there's paid editorial staff. But if the editorial work is also part of that scholarly ecosystem where there is no paid staffing, then that's not really a cost factor. And that raises questions about tenure and promotion systems, which are beyond the scope of this conversation. But those are factors that if someone were to attempt an honest, open-ended price analysis and assessment of what something truly costs to produce, then these aspects and more aspects that are specific to that particular operation need to be taken into account. And honestly, what are we doing today? What is this costing us today as producers? How can we change the pricing model? Because the price calculations have to be based on current factors, not old factors from decades ago. And the other element, sorry, Zoom and my PowerPoint don't seem to be talking to each other very well. Sorry about that. And so there's some research that could be done in analyzing how much does something cost to produce, and what is sustainable, what is a price that libraries can actually pay. Some years ago at a Charleston conference, there was a session that had a very lively discussion afterwards. And the session itself started early, but there was conversation about e-content and how to earn from it from a publisher perspective. And this was in earlier days of aggregating databases and aggregated content from a variety of publishers. And at that time, there was a group of people who were commenting about micropayments, where the operations decide what level of income is needed to break even and maybe even make a profit. And what do I have to charge? And what if I need a certain dollar amount as earnings for my publishing house? Does this have to be direct subscriptions, or can this come from a much larger population of indirect subscribers and come to me in form of micropayments instead of full subscription payments, or buying an ebook and eBrary and ebook aggregated databases were fairly new at that point of the discussion, and there were a number of people who agreed with that concept. Well, since then, the aggregators have been stripped of some content, where publishers have developed their own platforms and pulled the content from the aggregators' databases, and that leaves libraries in the position of getting partial content up to an embargoed period, maybe anything up to 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 4 years ago, depending on the database and the framework. And then if the current content is absolutely needed, then there is a tendency to subscribe to the current issues from that publisher. And with the directions that library budgets are headed, paying for the content twice is no longer mathematically feasible. And one of the, and as I'm working on the research for business models, it seems that revisiting that conversation to see where it can go today could be worthwhile. How can we go back to micropayments? Can we have a different kind of conversation among librarians and publishers and aggregators so that everyone can actually participate in the ecosystem and not be so constrained by the absolute cap that's available in funding levels? There might be interest in the growing body of research, but if budgets are fixed, no matter how great that new and growing research is, that doesn't enable us to buy any of it, and that puts us in a bind. So I created a small poll for this conference, and unfortunately, it's not as user-friendly as more varied survey software. So I'm going to make a survey and post it I'll post another chat to my session. So if someone would like to fill out a survey, then we can do that. So most of the participants who filled out the poll so far were librarians. One person said other. I was really hoping to see what that other is. Is it an investor, like a holding company of somebody who has to produce value for someone demanding returns, or an author or something? I would have loved to know that. But unfortunately, the person who said other didn't answer. But here, when I asked what the biggest pain points are, the largest number was subscription price increases, while library budgets are either shrinking or at best flat. And another pain point that was large was recurring access fee for previously purchased content. And we've all seen resources that we buy with perpetual access, and then there are access fees. But in this budget climate, it becomes a pain point. And then there's an imbalance between the service capacity and what's actually needed. And the way I worded it that way is so that if someone who is a publisher or vendor can also feel the pain of that same issue, because we as librarians see the effects, but any conscientious professional working for a vendor or publisher is going to feel the same tensions of seeing, I really see what the customer needs, but we don't have the capacity to provide it because of the business structure. And outdated purchasing models for digital contents were also an issue. Markets that are unresponsive to rapidly shifting needs. For example, with a recent pandemic-driven large shift to online education and supporting that with online materials, responsiveness has been very uneven and often very slow. And I also saw someone mentioning the lack of communication and mutual understanding, where the different parties in that mix don't really understand each other's perspectives, and reduced budgets and reduced revenue is having an impact on services. And I also worded this way so that a vendor or a publisher who is facing unstable income could also answer that question. And a company merger, And a company merger was another factor that was mentioned, how it can lead to diluted services or curtailed capacity or some combination. So here are some free text. And so just developing planning becomes very hard. Statewide might not work very well if the institutions are so different from each other that it's hard to get a collaborative process going. Finding a path is really hard. Developing collections is hard. Finding e-resources is hard. And so when I asked what people would like to see as changes, greater transparency in ebook pricing was mentioned. And here someone also said in the free text that, why are we paying access fees for something that we've already purchased? And yes, absolutely. Why not factor that into the price? And I've had some conversations with vendors in my negotiations and pointing that out. And some vendors, there's a move toward a one-time buyout price. You know, you pay a fee up front and then never again. But yes, this is one of the business models, activity-based costing examples, where the true analysis of what it costs to produce something would be very helpful in defining the true costs, so you can charge what you need in order to keep the operation going and not nickel and dime the buyers to death. And there was another study called Death by 1,000 Cuts related to library budgets. And the last set of comments I had was, again, transparent pricing models and some more consistency. And I see some of you are writing down notes. I'm going to put these slides up onto the conference site. I had some issues with the site of trying to get files there, so I thought I'll just do it later. But I will put this there, and I'll also put my source literature and a new link to more information. But in the interest of time, so what are some of your thoughts about business models? What are some of the pain points that have vexed your libraries the most? Okay, I see some chats.
Yeah, there's one statement, Angie.
Yes.
One of the issues we face is the change of service models that don't meet the requirements of our institution, such as named users when we prefer enterprise access. And it plays havoc with their user base as well as budget planning.
So are you referring to aggregators and database vendors that push people to an individual login, or as opposed to enterprise login?
Susan, if you want to unmute yourself. Okay, just ask her. Oh, all right. Yeah, we have a couple other comments here.
Okay.
Okay, so another pain point is when vendors bundling content together when we don't want the bundle, not the big deal really, but vendor who groups ebook collections by years. It's not useful. And another participant agrees. You know, we have similar issues, vendors that want to go to individual logins and move away from IP authenticated access. Okay, yes.
So that
Please,
seems...
yeah, please, Susan, go ahead and mute yourself.
Yes, excuse me, I agree with Elizabeth. That's what's happening is for things like journals and newspapers and other things like that, they want to go to named users. And so we think that's so they can feed ads or other track content and use more specifically. And we would have enterprise licenses before that, things like maybe Financial Times, to name one, but there's a large number of other things. So they want to be able to track individual usage. So people need to have usernames and passwords. We had enterprise use before that, so we could always know what our budget would be going forward. But with named users, they have very complex modeling then in terms of pricing. So that makes it very complex to plan budgets year on year because it will change depending on how many users and what tiers you go into.
Okay,
so
that makes sense. But we were able with one newspaper vendor, well, to negotiate a price for this year, but then next year would be based on this year's usage. So
yeah,
it might differ. I mean, you still have the differing. But we even have some big databases now. Jane's, which is a big defense, and Fitch Connect that are both moving to this model. And I'm at the Naval War College Library, so we have an extra layer of security access issues, and we have distant students that don't have the same .edu email, and we have spent literally hours and hours on the phone with both publishers and our IT department trying to find a solution that will work for everybody. It's a pain. But.
Yeah, we've been able to hold off with a couple of the people because it is a budget issue, and it's like, you know, either we do this or we drop you as a vendor. We are not an academic institution. We are a research institution, actually. So we have a little bit of a different issue than some of you do, but it's the same.
I mean, on the other hand, we a couple of times we have a few very niche kind of think tanks, China Maritime Studies Institute, for example, and we have been able to get much better pricing when we've been able to restrict a very specialized resource that only they are going to use. So, I mean, I guess I'm surprised to always push back and always ask for something. It's been my.
Yeah, us too. And we are a think tank. So yes, we do too. We push very hard. So yeah, we are in the same boat, and we suggest that everybody, of course, do that. We have found some that will bend to our will, but others that do not. But we try very hard.
But it also seems, wouldn't Well, maybe in a think tank, you don't have the student population there, but wouldn't universities run afoul of FERPA regulations with regard to student confidentiality in having named users as a forced default? We have some services where we have the enterprise login through a proxy server and IP validation. At the same time, there's an optional individual user account that people can create. So for example, if I'm in a research site and I want to save some articles for various projects that I'm working on, then if I voluntarily set up an individual user account, then the system on their end knows which user space to save those to. But that might be worth revisiting with those providers in stating that as an organization serving students, there's a confidentiality that cannot be broken, and keep safeguarding student data and forcing named users, that would run afoul of FERPA. And I'm surprised to hear vendors going in that direction.
So we
To
have
such a
about,
large,
Yeah, authentication isn't really my thing, but I think there's a way for the vendor to have that named access, but it's still confidential with different kinds of SAML or smart card kinds of one log on access, but I don't confess I don't understand it. So.
So what are some other pain points?
Yeah.
I'm looking at my clock to make sure.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, you have about 10 to 15 minutes because it just shuts off a few minutes after 1 o'clock.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's a lot of very good comments in the chat. Kathleen says, I would like the ability to purchase any ebook, but not just the ebooks that the publisher has designated as appropriate for library purchase. And Faye says, this is more access related, that she really struggles with the cost of e-resources that are inaccessible to users with disabilities. That vendors will push out new and improved platforms that are basically unusable with assistive technologies. So, it doesn't necessarily mesh. And, another person has similar problems with Economist, journal, they really want a single user, not a library. So the licensing agreements. Also frustrating when you're working with the PDA model, when the title your users want is not available as an ebook. Transparency on ebook pricing would be useful as well due to the cost differential. And one person has implemented a virtual ebook shelf with ATO-DDA purchase of ebooks. This way it's not always available given ebook bundling, and that publishers are leaving money on the table. Another person, said that they walked away from deals. And so there's been interesting, that there's some vendors that we just won't work with because the business models are unattainable. And that another person purchases ebooks, individual ebooks from EBSCO. It's not a charge. And that we're just standing up Overdrive for individual ebooks that we don't necessarily need for long-term access. So I think,
and Overdrive doesn't have much of a tradition of serving academic libraries. So I've been watching their offerings to see how it evolves. So that would be really interesting to see how your experience goes, Susan, with Overdrive.
Yeah, that they're just trying it out. And then, there's the cost You know, they had an issue, Elizabeth had an issue with Cambridge book that they
I can
designated as
just
a
talk
textbook.
if you want. I don't
Okay,
want to
sure.
monopolize the conversation. I was just going to say, you know, provide lots of feedback. We provided a ton of feedback last year. We were really unhappy with the model. We had to purchase the book that way because it was a textbook being used in a class. So we had to pay them the ridiculous amount of money they wanted because they designated this particular book as a textbook. So it's a whole different pricing model. And I mean, I'm sure other people chimed in, but as a result, Cambridge has a whole new textbook platform now. We're paying a quarter what we paid last year. I thought the invoice was wrong. And there's a whole lot more functionality. So it's definitely worth it. I've got some great librarians who work for me and they kind of hammer on these vendor reps. But this one was particularly annoying because students were able to buy the book on Kindle for like $25. So 25 times the number of students in the class was a whole lot less than we were paying. Plus the 2 faculty members who were teaching the class, it was their book that they wrote. So I also wanted to hammer on them and say, pay attention to the license, pay attention to what you sign when you make a deal with a publisher. I mean, you know, you've given away your intellectual property and now we're paying for it at a high price. So.
And that is an issue throughout that world. And it's a sticking point that needs to be brought forward. And at the very least, a heavy discount for material produced by our own scholars should be part of that conversation. But yes, we've all seen publishers that don't seem to understand textbooks the way we do, because there's some things that one particular publisher marks as textbooks that are also used as professional desk references. And I remember having conversations with that particular publisher's rep that we are training those future professionals in our graduate programs, in our clinical programs. They're learning how to use these as professional desk references, and textbook is too narrow a definition for the way this is really used in real learning life. And the rep understood that, but the company wasn't willing to go anywhere with that. And so we're still having that conversation. Yes, graduate students are learning about the business side. And I think our faculty colleague in this environment of responding to the pandemic operations with large scale online resources, the faculty members are also having a crash course in business models that don't make much sense when you'd really talk through them. Kindle books for the library. So there's an issue that Kindle books and Apple ebooks and all of those, they're all pegged to an individual login. And that's the rub that keeps libraries from purchasing those for the whole library user populations. And so there's that silo. And I've seen that with streaming films and other resources where it's tantalizingly there in an individual purchase format that an individual can pay for. But as a library, we want to follow the instinct of supporting our users so they don't have to pay out of pocket for what they need. Yes, someone mentioned iPad. I've seen that done where a collection of ebooks was bought for the iPad or Kindle, and then users would check out the Kindle or the device, and then they would have the device checked out to them that has the entire collection on it. But that's indirect, and it's still a barrier between what's truly needed.
So we're coming up to time.
Okay.
So, yeah, So Susan says we wish we could buy Kindle books. Our users do.
I see that.
Yeah. And did you see Chris's comment?
Yes, very much so, which goes back to that bundle. And some bundles are just grab bags. And we want to target our support for users, not get this grab bag of unrelated stuff where you have to get this mix when there's one book that we truly want. And we've walked away from those kinds of deals because it's not a good stewardship of our funds. Well, I wish we had more time, but it looks like we don't. So,
Yeah.
and I would hate for us to get cut off.
But it is being recorded. And so you can, people can always go back, and maybe you could put your email address in the chat.
Yes. Okay, if I can get the chat to come up, the app isn't very,
Okay.
okay, I'm going to stop sharing, see if that makes a difference. So now you're going to see my silly face trying to find the interactive thing.
Some people have given you their email address.
Okay, I'm just not getting, oh, here it is. All right.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm gonna stop
Wait.
recording.
No, wait, I got to put my email address. It went just to you instead of everyone. So let me post this to everyone.
Okay, yeah, just, yeah, you could change it to everybody in meeting. I just did that. I put down everybody in meeting. I changed it.
Okay, well, thanks very much.
see it.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I'll put my slides onto the conference page, and I'll probably wait till the wee hours over the weekend when no one else is on the site. I think that might have been the issue, trying to get my materials uploaded. So I'm just going to wait and put it up. I'll put my email address. My email address is on the final slide, and I'll also put my bibliography of source material as part of my slide deck, and the article that encapsulate our conversation is going to be in the Charleston Conference proceedings also. So you'll see something in writing about the needs that we have. And one of my goals then is to take those documented needs into conversations with our vendors and publishers and the various partners in this ecosystem.
Okay. So, should I stop it now?
Well, if we're coming up to time, probably yes, so that we don't get cut off and kicked out. But thanks very much, everyone, for coming. And
thank you.
And I hope to meet all of you in person at the next Charleston conference when we can travel again.
Okay. Yeah, I'm getting a message. Do you want to stop cloud recording? So I'm going to say yes.
Okay.